sense, this is what the British Logic Colloquium is about. It's about getting people who recently arrived in the UK and give them the floor to present their research to the other UK logicians. Sara just accepted a job at Durham University a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
She got her PhD from the University of Amsterdam in 2009. She had some postdocs in Tilburg and then in Heidelberg. She was headhunted by the Buddhist logicians who wanted to know how to do formal analysis of Buddhist logic after she had done it for medieval logic. And her talk will be about where are the women in medieval logic.
Yes, so thank you very much, Benedict. It's a pleasure to be here to give kind of my first talk as a British logician to British logicians, even though, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not really British at all. This talk is very much exploratory. It's reporting on some kind of foundational and beginning research that I'm getting started on that has grown out of two recent developments in kind of not necessarily logic research, but in the study of logic more generally. So the first of these is a growing interest in medieval logic, particularly amongst philosophers, but also some of the mathematicians have gone back and started looking at what can we do with the syllogistic? What can we do for analyses of paradoxes? These are all sorts of questions that logicians, by the Middle Ages, I mean roughly the 11th to 15th centuries, but I'm willing to stretch on either direction when it suits my purposes. They were interested in a lot of the same questions that we're interested in today, and so maybe by going back and looking at these, we might learn something interesting. So there's that on the one hand. This is what a lot of my logical research has been related to, is going back and looking at these medieval texts and seeing what's in them that might still be of interest and of relevance to logicians today. The other one is somewhat more negative, and this is the growing recognition of a pretty bad gender imbalance in philosophy, in mathematics, and unfortunately, logic lying at the intersection of these two tends to get the worst of both worlds. There are not many women in philosophy, there are not many women in mathematics. You combine these two, and if you look at people in philosophy or math departments in the UK who are listed as logicians, there are very few women, not just at professor level, at any level.
You could add computer science if you want.
Yes, sadly, I can. But anyway, so a natural combination from these two factors is, well, okay, not many women in logic now. Medieval logic was interesting. Where are the women in medieval logic? And in fact, this particular question came out of someone who was writing an introduction to a new handbook on medieval logic. It's like, none of the authors that we talk about are women. Why is that? So the easy answer, of course, is that there weren't any. We don't know of any medieval women logicians because there were not any. And I even have a proof. This is my one proposition and proof in this slide, so you better enjoy it. Logic was practiced in the universities. Universities didn't admit women. Ergo, there were no medieval female logicians. All right, we can all go home now. The answer, of course, is not quite so easy. So it is true that women were not allowed to study at Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, a lot of the Northern European universities, all of which were founded kind of in the early 13th century. So that's the period that I'm talking about here, until quite late. In some cases, in some colleges, not until 7 centuries later. But this is specific to Oxford and Paris and Cambridge, and as I said, these northern universities. It's not true of Italian and Spanish universities in the Middle Ages. They were much more liberal at admitting women to study at them. Another problem with the easy answer is that the university is not the only place that you can go to learn something. Medieval women were educated, particularly if they were of a certain class and a certain standing. If they weren't educated at the university, where were they educated? There were other alternatives. Also, and this is where I say I'm willing to stretch the definition of Middle Ages as suits my purposes, there's more to the Middle Ages than the 13th century onwards. If you're going to exclude the possibility of women logicians just by saying they didn't work at the university, that omits a good couple of centuries worth of pre-university period where we might find interesting work being done. So to just talk about each of these issues, as I said, in Italy and in Spain, the restrictions on women attending university were much less. And in fact, we do have a few documented examples of women serving not only as students at these universities, but as professors. So Maria di Novella was professor of mathematics at Bologna in the roughly middle of the 13th century. Dorothea Bucca, so slightly later, end of the 14th century and into the 15th, was the chair of both medicine and philosophy at Bologna, having inherited the chair from the death of her father. More interesting is someone whom I've actually been able to find very little about, in part because I don't speak Spanish, is Beatriz Galindo, who she studied grammar at one of the dependent institutions of Salamanca. So this gives a little bit of evidence for the second point, that you might not have studied at university, but there might have been affiliates of the university that you could study at. But then she later on actually went to teach philosophy at Salamanca and was also kind of headhunted by Isabel the Catholic to be her Latin tutor. She wrote a commentary on Aristotle, the Notes and Commentaries on Aristotle, which has been attributed to her. I have been able to find almost nothing about the Notus other than its existence available in English. So I don't know whether she speaks about any of Aristotle's logic. But this is one of the first places that I want to go and look at in part of this research project that I'm building. So to turn to the question of study outside the universities, you get private tutoring. Eloise, who I will speak a little bit more of in a bit, had her own private tutor, Abelard. Flamenca and Margarita, these are not actual people. They show up in a late 13th century, I think it's about circa 1287, Occitan romance. But there's a part in it where Flamenca said to her, "Who has taught you, Margarita? Who has shown you by the faith you owe to me such dialectic?" Dialectic being, of course, the medieval term for logic, covering not just purely, strictly speaking, syllogistic reasoning skills, but argumentation and verbal skills more generally. So here, Margarita learned dialectics from somebody. We, of course, don't know whom. It was probably some man, but it's part of the story, and it's not highlighted as something unusual, but just as, you learned something interesting, tell me who you learned it from. I might want to go study with him too. Somewhat, actually, quite a bit more earlier, you could even do your studying essentially by correspondence course. There are letters from Alcuin, who was one of the advisors of Charlemagne, written to nuns where he discourses to them about syllogisms. So there are more opportunities than just studying in the university in order to have access to these sorts of things. So in order to answer, or in order to make a start towards answering the question of where are the women in medieval logic, I actually want to ask two different questions by means of giving an answer. The first question is, what is logic? The second question is, what is a logician? We could add the third question, which is, what is the Middle Ages? But as I said, I'm going to just define that as I wish. We're not going to get into the question of what is a woman. That is too far philosophically gone. Okay, yes, I think that gets all of us then. So there are two ways that you could kind of define or map out the scope of logic if you are interested in looking at some historical aspect of it. There's a broad view and a narrow view, kind of very crudely speaking. You could say logic is what logicians do and practice nowadays. It is the sort of thing that you find logicians presenting on at conferences like these, and then we should kind of take that, project it onto the Middle Ages, and see, can we find anything that falls within that spotlight? Of course, if you do that, you are almost setting yourself up for failure, because logic has changed quite a bit over the centuries. What we are doing nowadays does differ from what they were doing in the Middle Ages. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find complex analysis or real closed fields or model theory or any of that. But you could take a more broad view of it and say, well, what was considered logic in the Middle Ages? And then try to take that and look at, that will be our scope. Can we find anybody working within that kind of context? So I've already mentioned dialectic. This was essentially, dialectica and logica were interchangeable vocabulary words for medieval logicians, particularly once you reach the university period and logic or dialectic became one of the 3 subjects that every undergraduate had to study. This is something I would love to make our modern universities more medieval and bring back the logic requirement for all undergrads, but we'll see how that goes. So we can take, firstly, the medieval definition of logic and look at dialectic as a general study. But you might also want to say that even if it's not strictly speaking logic, there are kind of adjacent fields that you want to look into because they might have something interesting in any case. And given that we already know that there isn't that much material out there, there's not just scads of women out there waiting to be found, we should broaden our nets to see what we can get. So I will also include issues of philosophy of language, because this is where questions of meaning and signification, and also in general where questions of truth and falsity come in. So these are maybe not strictly speaking logic, but certainly logic adjacent and could be informed by and inform logical developments. Thirdly, we have argumentation and the practice of debate. So the actual application of logic. You are taught all of these different reasoning tactics. Well, let's go out and actually see them in practice. Are there discussions of styles of argumentation or rules for argumentation? Do we have records of debates, perhaps, that women were involved in? By looking at these, we can actually learn quite a bit about the social and academic culture of the practice of logic in this period. So then the question of what makes someone a logician? What is a logician? Is a logician someone who writes treatises on logic, who has theorems, definitions, propositions, proofs, and who creates these historical artifacts that we can, as modern logicians, can go back and look at and say, yes, it's slightly different notation and it's somewhat different subject matter, but they're doing basically the same thing that we're doing. We start off with definitions, we give a couple of lemmas, we give some proofs, we build it up to a main theorem. If anybody in the audience has ever looked at any medieval logicians, Thomas Bradwardine's thesis on the liar paradox is very much set up like this. If you read it in translation into English, you can read it and say, yeah, they're doing the same thing that we're doing. But the other option is that a logician is someone who actually practices logic, who uses it, who doesn't just write about it, but actually puts it into practice. Now, if we go with the first question, that a logician is one who writes treatises on logic and gives us insight into kind of the theoretical background and the research culture of logic in the Middle Ages, then I will grant the negative answer. We are extremely unlikely to find anybody, any woman, who is writing theoretical treatises on logic. Beatrice Galindo's treatise might be an exception. That's one of the reasons why I would like to look at it. But so in that kind of context, we are probably unlikely to find anybody that would meet these particular criteria. There are 2 particular reasons for this that I want to point out. One is that there was a strong connection between the production of textbooks or theoretical treatises and university activity. Most of the logical books that we have were written by students of philosophy doing their Master of Arts, and what you did in the course of your master's was you wrote a textbook on logic and lectured on it to your undergrads. So if you were not a part of that university culture, it was unlikely then that you would have a reason to create these sorts of textbooks or theoretical treatises. There's also something that I have it called here, this male-female antagonism. I'm not entirely happy with this sort of description, but you do occasionally find certain glimpses of interaction between men and women where they, for whatever reasons, and whether kind of sincerely or ironically, are going to put up their hands and say, I am not going to interact with you on the basis of logical argument. So there's, I couldn't find the precise quote from Eloise when I was looking for the slide, so I just have this secondary source. But there is a point where she specifically tells Abelard in one of her letters, I am not going to engage with you in what he calls this tradition of dialectical disputation, the social customs of ritualized male aggression. So that would be one reason why you wouldn't find women engaging in these sorts of things. And I will come back further to Christine and what she's writing to Pierre Hall. But there's at one point where in one of her letters, she specifically says, I am not a logician. So there are kind of explicit rejections by certain well-educated, well-regarded, highly, well-respected women who are saying logic is not for me. But as I said, I will come back to what we can take from that. If, on the other hand, we go with the idea that a logician is someone who is practicing logic or who is involved in these questions of signification and meaning and truth and argumentation and debate, then the spectrum opens up. I don't have much time, but I'm going to just briefly put up a couple of different names of people that would be this is the first pass. These are the ones that you would want to start to look at because we know their names, we know their texts, and we have some hope of having access to them. So let's find out what these women have to say, and then we can go on for the ones that we don't know anything about and whose texts we don't necessarily have. So I will just briefly run through these for reasons of time. We have Dwora in the 9th century. She wrote essentially a guidebook of proper behavior for her sons. In it has evidence that she was a relatively well-educated woman. She knew the grammarian Donatus, who became kind of the standard grammar textbook that was used in the universities, with Isidore's etymologies, which were part of kind of the pre-11th, pre-12th century logical corpus. So she had access to at least some of the same sources that the kind of proper male logicians had. Hildegard of Bingen is a name that maybe some people also have heard of. She wrote extensively fiction and nonfiction. While a lot of her work was primarily in botany and in medicine and not really in the philosophical areas, she is considered to have a very strong role in the history of rhetoric, in part because of she wrote a lot of theological letters and poems, and also went on the circuit as a traveling preacher. So again, rhetoric, not specifically speaking logic, but it's one of the adjacent fields, and looking more deeply into what her principles of rhetoric were might shed some interesting light. So Eloise hardly needs any introduction. Anybody who's done anything with game theoretic semantics has at least heard of Abelard and Eloise. But she lived at the early part of the 12th century. She was the student of and lover of Abelard, and one thing that is true is that if you are spending a lot of close proximity with another logician, you are going to talk about logic. There is no way that Eloise could have studied with Abelard and not learned some amount of logic from him. And in fact, after Abelard's death, we have a letter to her from Peter of Cluny, who complimented her on the fact that she had left logic for the gospel, Plato for Christ, and the academy for the cloister. So this is, she was being praised for having left it behind, but it shows that she had studied it, she had learned it at some point. So Eloise is another one whose works are known but have never been looked at to see what sort of kind of logically interesting material are in them. I said I would return to Christine de Pizan because she is somebody that I am very interested in looking at from this perspective. Born in Venice in the middle of the 14th century, but got married to a Frenchman, spent most of her life in and around the Parisian royal court. She wrote courtly poetry, but also books of practical advice for women. The Book of the City of Ladies, and I didn't put the title of the other one up. These are very interesting books because they are written in a highly kind of formalized dialectical style. So the Book of the City of the Ladies is a dialogue between Christine and three allegorical women: reason, justice, and rectitude. Now, I find it particularly interesting that reason, i.e. the domain of logic, is being represented as a woman here. So it is not essentially antithetical that, there is this, as I said, the male-female antagonism. Logic doesn't have to be excluded from the female side of things. It's written in a highly skilled dialectical style that shows that she was conversant with kind of the philosophical genres of her time. So in this period, in the mid-14th century and into the 15th century, much of the university philosophical texts are written in a sort of disputational style. You have a question, and then you have an argument pro and an argument contra, and you have a response, and you have a response to the response, and so on in this back and forth sort of style. So this style of dialectic is very closely tied to the development of logic and kind of formalized disputations. So I said that she wrote in this letter at some point, "I am not a logician. Do not judge me by the standards of reasoning and of knowledge that you judge yourself and other men." In a sense, what she's doing at this point is specifically trying to distance herself from this sort of male-dominated, logic-ruled world. However, not very much further on, in this same letter, she uses exactly the same sorts of logical techniques that she has just said, I'm not a logician, but I'm going to go and I'm going to reason as if I were one. But I'm not going to say this out loud because this kind of gives away my story. So she puts forward a logical puzzle. If you say yes, then it is false. But if you tell me no, then you have proved true my proposition. She has essentially set him a liar-like paradox. So this is somebody who is, when she says, "I'm not a logician," you have to take this with some amount of salt, because she is using the same sorts of techniques that a logician would for proving her point. So more needs to be read between the lines there. Julian of Norwich was born in Norwich around 1342, the first woman known to have written in Middle English rather than in Latin or in French. She is best classed actually not as a logician, hardly even as a philosopher, but rather as a sort of mystic theologian. So one of her texts, the long text, it's around 63,000 words, is a treatise reflecting on a set of divine visions that she had, trying to interpret them and what their meaning is. So as a result, this text it's both reportative on what the content of the visions were, but also kind of meta-reflective on questions of meaning and signification. And again, work hasn't been done specifically on her views of signification, but the little bits that I've been able to look at so far, it's very complex. We have just a brief quote here: "Wouldst thou wet in this Lord's meaning in this thing? Love was his meaning." So she is very interested in questions of what do words mean, how do they mean, how do they get their meaning, how do they interact with each other, and then of course, because this is the Middle Ages, what is the connection between this and salvation? But even setting aside the theological questions, the philosophy of language that is within her works, I think, is of interest. So that was just kind of a whirlwind tour of a couple of people where this research can hopefully get started, but certainly not end. And I want to close very briefly with just some brief comments on what do we gain from being involved in this sort of research. First of all, a better understanding of our history. And I have done enough history of logic to know that you're always bound to be at some conference where someone says, and they didn't know anything about X until modern times. And I will raise my hand and say, except for so-and-so who did in the 15th century. So, those who do not learn their history are doomed to repeat it. By gaining a better understanding of our history, we can hopefully avoid some of that repetition. We get the ability to reassess the contributions of women. And this is kind of not logically important, but sociologically important, because the Middle Ages were a period where women were disproportionately not, I don't know the right word, but they were disproportionately it compared to men. And so maybe by going back and reevaluating the contributions that we have with them, we can give a better understanding of the actual role and place that they had in this history. Of course, simply by looking at the material, regardless of who it's written by or what kind of material it is, you're going to find new and interesting things. Things that will help us, that we can bring towards our modern questions, and also that we can take all of our modern tools, bring them back to the Middle Ages to help understand these things. And ultimately, my kind of 10-year plan is I hope that this will be a foundation for a much broader project that goes beyond just the European Middle Ages, but eventually looks at the role and place of women logicians in ancient Greece, the medieval Arabic tradition, ancient India, ancient China, the Renaissance, the early modern era, and even, I think, the contributions of women to logic in modern times is not as well recognized as it should be. So these are the pictures I started off with. That's Eloise getting a lesson from Abelard, Hildegard receiving a vision. You can see it's kind of pouring down into her head. Christine is actually lecturing to men right here. And there's Julian of Norwich, a carving from a church, actually, I think in Norwich. And she's probably mystically reflecting on something. Anyway, thank you.
I heard St. Teresa of Avila described as the first modern woman. I wonder, did she go in for logic?
I would have to look. I haven't checked. I will add her to the list.
Other questions?
That's another.
No, I was wondering about before that, like during the time of Plato and Aristotle, were women active scientifically?
Yeah, so I don't know the ancient period as well, but I've done a little bit of work into it. There's an excellent book called Hypatia's Daughters, which looks at women in kind of the Greek philosophical context. Of course, we don't have that much information about the male philosophers outside of Plato and Aristotle. And so often what we get in terms of the female philosophers is just record of their existence, but nothing of what they said. But reportedly Diodorus of Kronos, his daughters were all logicians, and there are other people who are mentioned.
Another question. You didn't use the word trivial.
Yes.
Which I've often heard used to summarize logic.
Logic, grammar, and rhetoric. Yeah.
Yes. So from what you were calling logic seemed to be not separate from rhetoric. In the trivium it was.
Yes, so the trivium developed as part of the 13th century university curricula. That's when you start getting this kind of division into the different disciplines of grammar and logic and rhetoric. And this, of course, led to all sorts of interesting questions, because as soon as you try to make divisions in curricula, you then start getting questions of, well, is this grammar, is this logic? Prior to that, so in the 12th century, you're not really going to find so much worry about, is this rhetoric or is this dialectic? And I think that given the close relationship of them, both as university curricula and just in the way that they developed historically, looking at one may be interest when you have interests in the other.
It's maybe not so an important question, but I wondered at the point when you mentioned this quote that logic is depicted as a woman, and this shows that there's not necessarily an antagonism. Okay, so this might be very anachronistic, but I would think that let's say someone from the 19th century who would say that women should not engage in logic, he would have said, well, that's precisely because logic is a woman, and maybe that's some kind of a romantic picture of the intellectual.
I can see what you mean by saying this sounds very Victorian, saying
exactly.
something like that.
So you would say it's probably anachronistic.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, in these cases, it is typically the grammatical gender of the word
Yes.
determines.
Philosophia, logica.
So that's okay.
So
Yes.
the reason is just feminine, and therefore.
Yes, Justitia and rectitudo. That's neuter, isn't it? No? Okay.
Any last comment? Then let us close this session.